Uh, I'm gonna first introduce Tom White here in just a minute, who is another veteran of the Cohen Center, and he's going to provide a little bit of background and overview about the center, just a brief something to get us kind of oriented to the center. And many of us know a little bit about it, but every time I hear them talk about it, I learn things I didn't know about it. So I'll look forward to that. Then we're going to turn it over to Peter and give him a chance to talk a little bit about his background. If you can't tell from the visual, he's joining us from Northern Ireland, where he's been stuck, I guess, or since he became the director, and hasn't had a chance to move full time over to Keene yet. But so we're pleased that he's been able to do that, and we're going to talk a little bit about his background and what brought him to this position, but also give him a chance to reflect a little bit on what he's seen and heard so far about the center from afar. And then and I know he's interested in hearing from people here about what the future of the center might look like. So that's the basic outline for the morning. We will leave plenty of time at the end, not really that far into it, to get your input and ideas and ask questions of Peter or Tom. And as Phyllis said, you could do that in the chat box, or we'll just there's a raise your hand feature as well that you can use, if those of you know how to do that, and we'll try to make sure that everybody has a chance to participate. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom White, and take it away, Tom.
Well, good morning, everyone. So Tom White, I'm the coordinator of educational outreach at the Cohen Center, and I thought what we do is briefly give you an outline of the center to ground us all in a common space. As you know, we have a brand new building, and this is what it looks like when you enter the library at Keene State College, the Mason Library. And we have 3 staff currently at the center: Peter, the new director, myself in my position, and Michelle Kiawa, who's a senior program support assistant. And we are on Facebook and also YouTube. You can just look up Cohen Center. On our YouTube channel, we have all of our a lot of our lectures, our annual Kristallnacht remembrance, and various other things that are really handy. To remember to teach is sort of our tagline that guides us from our founder, who was Professor Charles Hildebrandt. Our mission, I guess, really straightforward. I won't read it to you, but you can see what it is. And the idea is to use the Holocaust as sort of a lens to look at genocide, to look at current issues, and really focusing on our constituents, which are our students, you, and the greater community, to really confront issues of escalating violence, as genocide and mass atrocity crimes are a process, not an event. We believe it's very important to intervene when a trajectory starts that could have a very negative ending. And so we're really teaching a lot about civic responsibility, and here again on campus of Keene State College is our new center. We are one of the oldest, if not the oldest, center in the country, and really that was the vision of Charles Hildebrandt, who was a Keene State College professor, and almost single-handedly with a lot of help that he inspired, created our Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We have an extensive library video collection, which is all online. You can get that through interlibrary loan. All you'll need is a Keene Public Library card, and a growing archival collection of materials from the Second World War and other related material that you can access as well. We're a member of the Association of Holocaust Organizations, which is a global network. We work with the Center for Peace Building for Bosnia and Herzegovina, recognized as a center of excellence by the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous for our educational outreach program, have been recognized by New England Board of Higher Education as an excellent center. And we partner with what is in the upper floor of the center, the nation's only undergraduate major in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Some things you might know about us or remember, some achievements that we've had. Paul was very much involved in this, and Paul is joining us in our call today, helping Larry Benequist, Bill Sullivan, and Tom Durnford research Martha and Wade Still Sharp's contribution as righteous among the nations, recognized by Yad Vashem, by the state of Israel, as the second and third Americans to be named righteous. These are people who risk their lives with no financial benefit, simply to try to help out their neighbors. And Ken Burns then teamed with other filmmakers and our professors to create the PBS film Defying the Nazis, the Sharps War, about Martha and Wade Still Sharp that you may have seen. In 2008, honoring the 25th anniversary of the Cohen Center, Kaddish was created and done by Larry Siegel. And here its performance debut on the lower left in 2008, and then to Yad Vashem, where it was then performed in Israel, and remembering the Cohen Center.
Hey, Tom, I'm not sure if you're trying to share some things on your screen, but I don't see it. I don't know if other people do either. So it sounds like you might be referring to.
I am. Let me see if we can.
Yeah, you need to share your screen, Tom.
I thought I had done so. Here we go.
There we go.
There we go. All right. So this is where we are currently, and as there we go. We've gone back to the beginning, but some of the things I talked about already, and here is the Sharps War that I just mentioned, and Kaddish. So here, the new building, of course, and some of the things we do annually. We have an annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture. We bring in leading scholars or survivors to tell their story or about their work. Our annual Genocide Awareness Lecture. Many of you are familiar with and participate in, gratefully, the Kristallnacht Remembrance. It takes place in November every fall at the Colonial Theater downtown. The center sponsors a trip for Keene State College students to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And then we have 2 awards that we want to make more public and more important, of course, the Charles Hildebrand Holocaust Studies Award and the Susan J. Herman Award for Leadership in Holocaust and Genocide Awareness. Here is Phil a couple of years ago at our annual Kristallnacht Remembrance. And again, this is one of our significant important events of town-gown relationship where the colonial fills and we take a moment just to remember what happens when societies devolve into authoritarian dictatorships, and in this case, targeting people to be annihilated. And Kristallnacht was sort of one of those last threshold moments where the Nazi state tipped toward mass atrocity and genocide. And so we try to remember and bring social awareness to and a civic awareness to our responsibility when we see evil being perpetrated. Held in downtown Keene at the Colonial Theater, a community event. And again, bringing the community together to bear witness, but then to say, what do we do with memory? And we think that means being responsible for those around us and for society as well, which is why we love to partner with all our good folks here in Keene. This is inside the new center and our educational outreach program that I'm in charge of, give you a general sense of our work, both on and off campus. We coordinate statewide initiatives and public programming, including, you may have just heard, New Hampshire now has mandatory Holocaust and genocide education signed into law by the governor a week ago. We also we're the 4th state in the country to have a Genocide Awareness Month, which is in April. I do classroom teaching, school programs, curricular development for teachers, in-service training, and so on and so forth. This happens on the local, national, and international level. I'm also a board member of the Association of Holocaust Organizations, which allows me a greater scope of my work. We work with survivors and witnesses. Our survivors, sadly, are few now and dwindling, but my job is to really keep that relationship going, to have a network with them and provide them chances to speak. Annual teacher workshop series, we bring in outside speakers and guests, and sometimes I do those as well. This will become more and more important with the mandate that I just mentioned. We also provide resources for teachers that are free. We have a film telling their stories, highlighting 4 Holocaust survivors who settled in New Hampshire, called New Hampshire Holocaust Survivors Speak Out. And we also have the Grubman Family Teacher Trunk that I'll show you just in a second. We have a speakers bureau. We do a 1-week residential summer institute, which is international in scope as well. Mostly New Hampshire and New England teachers, but we also bring in 4 or 5 teachers from overseas. I maintain a professional teacher network, which is a great resource for teachers who sometimes might feel isolated. They get support, but also curricular ideas. We have a website, Facebook pages, YouTube pages, Google, Cohen Center, YouTube, etc. It'll show up. We do teacher education on the campus of Keene State College. We also do public discussions in our new Cohen Center, dealing with issues that are of great contemporary concern. And I present to military bases in April, in that it is mandatory for the U.S. military to look at the Holocaust in April as part of a nationwide effort to remember the Holocaust. Community education and advocacy. I do adult ed at 5 different colleges around the state. And we have, as some of you are very well aware of, a coffee group of city leaders and invested people who meet every few months or so just to check in to see what is going on in Keene and what we should be aware of about people who may be targeted in our community, or how do we coordinate our efforts better. And of course, partnerships are very important for us. I won't list all the ones we have, but the one that'll be coming up next is the governor's new commission on Holocaust and genocide education that we'll be a part of. This is the Grubman teaching trunk. The Grubman family has been one of our earliest supporters. Much of our work is 85% is supported by donations, and that's so critical for us. And in this case, the Grubman family, Jim Grubman's family were survivors. And he started with supporting our children's collection. We have an extensive collection for children on this, and then funded his Grubman teaching trunk here, full of teacher supplies that teachers readily use, whole classroom sets, etc. And our residential summer institute, as you can see, these are where we have sort of the pockets of people trained, and the countries in which we've also trained teachers and have a network of graduates from Estonia, Germany, Hungary, Israel, Latvia, Romania, Slovakia, and Poland as well. Something we want to revive that we haven't done for a few years is our civic leadership project, which will bring community leaders or people interested in our mission to the museum in Washington, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, to look at how everyone's profession and life is affected by issues of discrimination, and the Holocaust touched every profession. And so this allows us to kind of reflect upon what is our role in the current world, building a world free of anti-Semitism, intolerance, and hate. And finally, making a difference, a couple of things that have happened that you may or may not be aware of. I mentioned already, one in September 2014, Governor Hassan signed into law April as Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. Again, New Hampshire, only the 4th state to do so. And then recently on July 23rd, here, Governor Sununu, again with Holocaust survivor Caddy Preston, who some of you may have met, who was a huge supporter and someone really pushing this bill, signing the Mandatory Holocaust and Genocide Education Act for New Hampshire schools. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. As you can see, those of you present, the center probably does a lot more than you're aware that it does. And I'm going to turn to Peter, and there we go. And start with the question, Peter, which I guess would go something like this. Keene, New Hampshire is not known to everybody in the world. So, I mean, we're trying to make it otherwise, but how'd you end up here?
That's a great, really good question, Phil. Jim Waller. So for the last about 3 years, this is a longish story. So Jim Waller, who's professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the Cohen Center, took a sabbatical in Northern Ireland, and while he was there, he eventually interviewed me, and he wanted to talk about the impact of the troubles there on people's mental health. So he came and spoke to me, and on the back of that, he then invited me to come and do some teaching for him on in the Auschwitz Institute. So I went out to Auschwitz in Poland for 2 week-long seminars in which I taught the relationship between trauma and genocide. And then on the back of that relationship, it was Jim who told me about the role that was available coming up in the Cohen Center, and I became interested in it. So it was through that route. And maybe so that's how I got here. If I tell you a little bit about where I come from, hopefully it will make sense to you, the journey that's brought me to here. So if you can't, well, you've already told people, but so you could also perhaps tell by my accent that I come from Northern Ireland. So I'm sitting here in a place called the Spa, which is near Ballynahinch, which is about 15 miles from Belfast. And the Spa is called the Spa because it has natural wells that the Victorians used to come here, and as the saying goes, they would come and take the waters. And I suspect if anybody took the waters now, they'd end up in hospital. But nevertheless, it's a beautiful part of the country. So Northern Ireland, as you know, I was born in 1964, so I'm 56. And the Troubles in Northern Ireland started in 1969. So all of my childhood into adulthood, I grew up with the experience of the conflict here. The Troubles ended in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So I grew up in a situation of a society that was in a state of, some will argue that language is argued about, but some will say describe it as civil war. Certainly violent conflict, and in which people were being murdered, blown up, shot, all those kinds of all that kind of violence going on. And I suppose there are a couple of things I would say about that. When you grow up in that environment, then effectively that's what's normal for you. So as a child, a person doesn't really consider themselves to be living in an abnormal environment. So for me, hearing about shootings and bombings on the news, being searched when I went into shops, being searched on my way to school, the army stopping the car at roadblocks as we were driving along, pointing guns into us, all of that was just normal. And honestly, I didn't think it was abnormal until I left home, went off to university, and I went to university in England initially. So this is, for me, this is really important, because it wasn't until I was exposed to a different way of thinking that I realized that the experiences that I've had were not normal. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. If you come to Northern Ireland, you'll be surprised at how, well, hopefully you wouldn't be surprised at how friendly we are, and actually how happy we are. So people in Northern Ireland, I think there was a survey done a while ago which said that Northern Ireland was one of the happiest places to live in the world. And that is despite the fact that we have, and I'll list it for you, highest rates of mental illness in Europe, the highest rates of suicide in some would say in the world, highest rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, highest rates of prescription medication for mental illness being taken. So there is a lot to say that 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, we're still a pretty messed up society. However, people cope with it and manage a particular way. So they will joke about it. They will, make light of it. Many people, if you came here and talked to people, and I would have said this frequently, will say, yes, I know it was terrible, but it didn't really affect me. I didn't lose anybody close to me. I didn't have close family members who were killed. I didn't witness any murders, so it didn't really affect me. What I have come to realize is that actually it did affect me, and it affected me quite profoundly. What I thought of as normal was not normal. So I often tell the story of coming home from school as a child and watching the news, and invariably on the news there would be news of a bomb has gone off in Belfast, or somebody has been shot, or something has happened. Now, my father, we lived in a place called Downpatrick, which was about 20 miles from Belfast. And my father worked in Belfast. So every morning before I was awake, he would leave early and drive to work in Belfast. And at home, he would drive home at about 6 o'clock in the evening. I remember it very clearly, coming home from school, watching the television, seeing things like that on the news, and then standing anxiously at the window, waiting to see if my dad would come home, because I wouldn't be quite sure if he was maybe one of the ones who'd been caught up in the bombing or the shooting. I realize now, with hindsight, that that's not normal. That's not a healthy way for a child to grow up. And yet that was the experience for most people living in Northern Ireland. So when I became an adult, I studied, went off to university. I started my career as a clergyman, as a Protestant clergyman. So that tells you which side of the community I grew up on. I left that very quickly, largely because I didn't like the fact that I was so strongly identified with one side of the community. I knew early on that I wanted to work with people and that I wanted to challenge and get involved in the peace process. So being a minister, I thought would give me a chance to work closely with people. Very quickly realized that I was extremely strongly identified with one side of the conflict. In fact, people who were perpetrators of violence in it. So I left the church, trained as a social worker, and I've worked for the last 30 odd years in the voluntary community sector, NGOs. Initially, I worked in a bereavement organization. And in that organization, I trained therapists and counselors, I trained supervisors to work with people who had been bereaved. And I noticed that people who had been bereaved as a consequence of trauma, in other words, people who had been bereaved as a consequence of violence in the conflict, grieved differently. Their grief was profoundly affected by their trauma, and in fact, deeply complicated by it. And for many people, they didn't grieve properly at all. And I began to wonder what that was about. And I came to a conclusion. So, what that's about is this, that when you experience a traumatic event, one of the things that happens to you is that the capacity to translate that event into a memory is compromised. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that over time, when bad things happen to us, there's a natural process that goes on whereby the kind of emotional impact of that starts to diminish. And we can remember the facts of it, but it doesn't continue to upset us because it's sort of detached from the emotional reaction to it. So, the old saying, time heals. I'm not a great sayer of that, but, with time, that emotional, the affect bit starts to diminish. If you've experienced a traumatic event or if you've been traumatized, that process doesn't happen. So what happens is that with time, the affect remains the same, the feeling remains the same. So if you're talking to someone who's been traumatized, then it's like the event happened yesterday. When they're describing what happened to them, it might have happened 20 years ago, but as they talk to you, it's as if it happened yesterday. They react the same way. They're as emotional as they were the day that it happened. They're affected in the same way. And when that traumatic event involved the loss of someone close to them, then clearly the process of grieving is compromised because for them, they're losing that person afresh every single day. And as I became interested in this, I became interested in the mental health consequences, the trauma consequences, or the mental health consequences of trauma. And I began to work in the field of mental health. And for the last 20 years, I've run a large mental health organization that provided support to people with mental illness, learning disabilities in the community. And then parallel to that, I became involved in the peace process using what I had learned to try and help the process. So what I had learned is this, that a population that has been traumatized doesn't find it easy to make peace. Why not? Well, if what I say is true, then that whole population keeps re-experiencing the trauma that it has experienced. It keeps going through it, going over it again and again and again. And that means that the people who at one side of the population were hurt by 20 years ago, they still feel frightened of and hurt by today because the trauma is still real. There's another thing, an important thing to factor into this as well, that lots of modern evidence and research has shown us, or is showing us, that trauma transmits generation by generation. It does it through both nature and nurture. It does it through nurture in the sense that families tell stories. I grew up with my family telling me about what my uncle did in the First World War in the Battle of the Somme. And my family held the trauma of his death generation by generation because I was told about it. But it's more than that. It's nature as well, that we now know that the effect of trauma gets transmitted epigenetically from parents to children. In other words, that this idea of a conflict footing, of being on edge, of experiencing the anxiety of trauma without necessarily knowing what the trauma was, that gets transmitted generation by generation by generation. So if you look at the conflict that I experienced here in Northern Ireland, it certainly was 30 years of violence here. but it was based on what you could argue is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of violence and trauma in the history of the island of Ireland, all of which culminates in whatever the most recent version of it is. So where are we today? And this will bring me on to why I'm so delighted to be working with the Cohen Centre. In Northern Ireland today, we are 20 years into the peace process. And this is a picture that I'm going to share with you of a mural on a wall in Belfast, where if you came and visited me today, I could take you to this place. And it's a wall in North Belfast which says, "Prepared for peace, ready for war." So this is over 20 years on past the Good Friday Agreement. This is 20 years of peace building, 20 years of really hard work to try and bring about reconciliation in Northern Ireland. And as I sit here talking to you today, we still have a divided education system. We have a divided sports system, leisure system, health system. If you are a Protestant, you will go to one church and one hospital and one school. And if you're a Roman Catholic, you will go to a different church, a different hospital, and a different school. So we still live in a divided society, and it's not violent in the way that it was in the Troubles 25 years ago. But the divisions that caused the Troubles are as real and as vibrant and as energized as they ever were. And my contention is that part of what energizes that conflict, what energizes this difference, is the experience of trauma that is experienced by individuals, certainly, but that is held and contained by groups, and then is reenacted again and again and again. And when a conflict or when a stimulant comes along, when something comes along to provoke a community, then the violence and the fear has been so internalized by that community that it doesn't take very much for it to react into violence again. So let me make the jump from that to the Cohen Centre. Cohen Centre is formed around memorializing the Holocaust. The Holocaust, the most significant, unique, iconic example of mass killing on an industrial scale in the history, I would argue, in the history of the world, certainly in terms of what we know about. And the Cohen Centre is committed to remembering and to teaching everything that we know about and want and can learn from the Holocaust. Also genocide, the experience of genocide that we have seen subsequent to the Holocaust, that we know about prior to the Holocaust, and the learning that we have about the factors in society that lead to modern day genocide. My point is that if you look around us today in modern America, in Northern Ireland, in Europe, in Russia, in China, it doesn't take long to see all the seeds of genocide. It doesn't take long to see people dehumanizing one another, speaking about other people as if they had absolutely no value and therefore deserved to die, and starting to create the architecture with which genocide can happen. So I am really interested in what I describe as applied Holocaust and genocide studies. In other words, using the lens of the Holocaust, using the lens of all that we know happened in the lead up to the atrocities that happened in places like Auschwitz and the many other death camps that there were, using that knowledge and understanding that we have, and looking through that lens, examining carefully what is going on in the world around us today. And also, and this is that is a challenging thing to do, but I promise you what is much more challenging is to look into our own hearts. The people who commit, I remember being in Rwanda and visiting a genocide site where it was shortly after the genocide there, and the bodies were still there. So this was a church, and the bones were all over the floor. And in order to be in the church, you had to walk on top of the pews. And the friends that I was there with, we were doing some training, and the friends that I were there with identified really strongly with the victims in that scenario. I found myself identifying with the perpetrators. I found myself thinking, the people who did this were people like me. They were friends and neighbors. The people who got up in the morning, kissed their children and their wives goodbye, and walked across the road into a death camp to murder thousands and thousands of Jewish people that day were people like you and me, who had taken a journey, had been influenced by society, had been influenced in lots and lots of ways to end up thinking that it was okay or acceptable or whatever to do the things that they did. So the challenge that we have in really taking seriously the message of the Holocaust and in really applying the lessons of it to our modern life and understanding the process that leads a society to end up in genocide involves all of us looking at ourselves and really asking tough questions about what is going on in our world and what we need to do about it. So the reason I am so delighted and so passionate about this new role that I have in the Cohen Center is it is an opportunity for me, I suppose, to say to you what I have just said to you. And I think it is an opportunity for us to make a difference. If I'm really honest with you, some of you know, I have the joy of a new grandchild. With the birth of a child, we all have to think about what world children are going to grow up into and what difference we need to make to that world. And I think we have the privilege of learning from the past in a way that other people have not necessarily had that privilege. And that privilege leaves us with a very important responsibility to do something about it. In the words of Chuck Hildebrand, who set up the Cohen Center, he didn't just say, the job of the Cohen Center is to remember. He said it is to remember and teach. So we need to teach and we need to learn, and we need to try and engage with some very scary stuff that's going on today. So I'm going to stop there and ask you if anybody has any questions or wants to ask me anything about what I've just said.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that. That was a great overview. I did not realize from our previous conversations that we may have been in Rwanda at almost exactly the same time, because I have been to that church.
Yeah. And
I know exactly what you're talking about. But I would turn it over to people. I think one of the questions on the table here is that the Cohen Center is part of the cultural ecosystem of Keene and the Monadnock region, and as a Chamber of Commerce, we kind of have a different lens. We look at the world through through mostly small businesses and occasionally some larger businesses and kind of the conducting of commerce, and that's another lens. But they are not mutually exclusive lenses. There's considerable overlap in the kinds of things that I believe that we as a business community need to be doing as well. That self-examination that you talk about is something that is only going to work if it takes place in all kinds of parts of our society and our community. So I want to try to engage the people on the call here to react to what Peter has said and kind of think about what how the Cohen Center can engage and what the role of the Cohen Center really is in our community from our perspective. They do a lot of incredible work, and Kristallnacht is one of the just absolutely top events of the year in Keene. But we have an opportunity to shape a little bit and to give Peter and Tom and Paul and others some feedback about how we think the Cohen Center could be helpful, whether it's through Jonathan Daniels or Black Lives Matter or some of the other things. So who would like to react to what Peter said? Does anybody have some thoughts? I see a couple of people. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I might put Chief Russo on the spot here just for a minute, because he's part of the coffee group that Tom referred to earlier, and that's a group of people, a very ad hoc group of people who get together periodically to just sort of share what they're seeing in the community. Steve, do you have any thoughts?
Nice to meet you, Dr. McBride. I read the article in the Sentinel a couple of weeks or a week or so, and frankly, I thought you were on your way here, but I had read in there that you weren't. So hopefully that will end soon. I'm Steve Russo, Police Chief of Keene. I've been a police chief for a little over 3 years now. Been here 21 years. We have not gotten together for a while. I missed, I think, the last Zoom coffee group that we had due to other commitments here. I really don't. It's difficult for me to go into what we're seeing right now because you've got, as I look at it, and I think a lot of people do, you have what's going on a national level, which really I think is the big picture, because then it expands down to depending on where you are. Are you in Los Angeles? Are you in New York? Are you in Boston? Are you in Keene? Are you in Hillsborough or some small town in Minnesota? I think what's happening is felt everywhere. And needs to be addressed everywhere to levels that are appropriate to where they are. And Ms. McBride, though, I've got to say, besides being through the airport in Ireland, I've never been to Ireland. But in my previous career, I have been pretty much around the world and have encountered things, genocide in one place, and it should never be allowed to happen again. It can never happen again. And the United States and every other country should do whatever they can to prevent that anywhere in the world. A little different than what we're seeing here, but I'm afraid that I'm seeing signs that we're not so much moving in that direction, but there are bad things happening, I think, with the United States that need to be addressed at a large level and locally. But I'm an optimist on that, and I think at least in this area, New Hampshire in general, we're doing quite well. Some things we need to address, and I believe we are trying to address those things. And hopefully we'll all move on. I could go on and on because I've talked with my sons that are in the 30s that are seeing things that they're questioning, and grandchildren as well, that are going to grow up with things that they never even questioned before, and now it's being brought to their attention and being brought up. Those are a little deeper conversations that I don't think we want to have right here. So I welcome you. The Keene Police Department welcomes you, and the City of Keene welcomes you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I just respond to that, and also what Phil said. What I'm talking about is not detached from economic success. What I'm talking about is not detached from the commercial interests of Keene. If Keene wants to attract young people to come and live in it, and if Keene wants to be, successful commercially with families wanting to come and live here, then some of the things that are bubbling around at the minute, and attitudes that start to develop nationally and internationally, those are some of the things that people look for. I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence around this, certainly about the millennials coming through, what characteristics they look for in an environment in order to go and live there, and it's usually attitudes around openness, tolerance, those sorts of things, which are very hard to measure. But if you live in a place that has them, you've got them. And I have to say, I've spoken now to a lot of people in Keene, and the impression I get very much is that you are people who are proud of the fact that Keene has that open culture, and no doubt there are challenges, but that there is a sort of an openness and an acceptance in the community. I think that what I think I'm trying to say is it is really important to be vigilant, because there are global pressures at the minute that are going a particular way, and the danger is that we find ourselves sleepwalking, accepting little things, or find ourselves sleepwalking into positions that then suddenly we realize are intolerable. So I think it's really important to to think about what being vigilant actually means. What is it that we need to look out for, and what are the signs that we need to take notice of, and how do we remain hopeful? Because how do we remain hopeful in the face of stuff that is terrifying? I think it's really important.
Thank you, Peter. While we're on that same track, I wanted to turn to the other chief on the call here for a minute, if I could, who's also part of the coffee group. And his department represents a different kind of first responder than the police department, although there's some overlap there for sure. But Chief Howard, do you want to weigh in at all?
Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Peter, again. We were able to meet in the last coffee chat.
Morning,
In
Chief.
a long career of the fire service, but being local, but being brought up locally and within a Catholic community and a Catholic family, I think what was most humbling for me, and I think it will be 9 years this year that I was first asked to present at the Crystal Knot evening, was having a father that was a World War II veteran and never spoke of, you know, those activities or what they dealt with or and so on, was learning what I didn't know. And even though the Colonial Theater is packed almost annually for Crystal Knot, it's and we sometimes use the term in the silo, at least amongst other departments, that sometimes we're in a silo because of our busy days and what we're responsible for. And even though, you know, Steve and I speak daily together as chiefs of the fire department and the police department, but you don't have those interactions potentially with all the other department heads, or more importantly, the community that's sitting here on this screen. It's why I've always been a fan of the coffee chats that have been put together, because we were able to offer our perspectives and they've been able to offer theirs. But the educational piece of the Cohen Center, as you come here and as the Cohen Center has worked, how can it be expanded, whether it's into the schools, the public schools, private schools? How can that be expanded? Because I'm concerned that that simple, important message briefly of the past and really what does the future look like, I think we're missing it. And I think I'm part of the problem of that, because I'm not helping you make that happen. I can tell you for 5 years, I've been going to have my staff almost want to require my staff to come to Crystal Knot to view that, because again, it's so humbling. So I've yet to accomplish that. Maybe we'll bring it here someday and do a presentation of similar to Crystal Knot and just roll the reel and watch the police and firefighters of what we all did. That alone was, you know, serving almost my entire adult life, not what I wanted to see, and embarrassed to see it. So I share that with you. I welcome you to Keene, and I look forward to working with you and the rest of the staff and actually everybody that's on our session this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief. I mean, I can promise you that as Phil alluded to, we are in the process at the minute of thinking about our strategy for the next number of years for the Cohen Center. So how are we going to engage with these important issues and how are we going to develop? I can promise you that one of the kind of key components of that is going to be education. The work that Tom does in schools and in the community is something that many, many people have talked to me about. And the same with Crystal Knot, the way that Crystal Knot has had such a profound impact on the community in terms of bringing this stark reality into people's consciousness has been really tremendous. So we will do nothing but build on that. And I would like us to see a much more extensive education program than we have at the moment. So I'm really pleased to hear what you say, and it confirms what other people are saying to me as well.
The last example that I would give, and it might help from the educational component, when we started to deal with the opiate issue now several years ago, and then Mayor Lane spoke with the police chief and I of, you know, he had a vision of what the city should do. Yeah. And the police chief and I at the time had a vision of what the mayor really what we thought would be best. And that was, there's many great agencies in the Monadnock region and in Keene. We said we needed to unite those agencies, not the city be the lead, but unite those agencies, because it was fractured then. I, as a fire chief, dealing with people every day, or the police chief, didn't even know some of the availability of some of the resources that were here locally. We united them, we brought them all to the same table, and it helped, I think, deal with our opiate crisis. I wish we were further ahead. than where we started. I think progress has been made, but I think there's a long ways to go. And from a mental illness standpoint or from an illness standpoint, it'll never go away, such as what the things that you're talking about today. But I give that as another example of a bigger issue and how it was tried to be, we tried to address it. And I think we've made progress.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chief and Peter. I see Pierre Morton on the screen, and I know I can put him on the spot and it won't freak him out at all. But Pierre, I wondered if you had some thoughts. I know you're relatively new to the region, for one thing, which gives you a certain perspective, and you're also serving on the mayor's Commission on Racial Justice that's started to do some work over the last couple of months. Do you have any comments on what you've heard so far?
Thank you, Phil. This has really been quite enlightening. Mr. McBride, thank you for speaking with us and for your work. Mr. Tom White, thank you as well for what you're doing at the Cohen Center. I'm going to take a look at that. So I am new, sort of a year to Keene. From Phoenix, Arizona, Connecticut. I've lived in Dallas, Texas. I've lived in San Francisco, and I've lived in Evanston, Illinois. And so, I'm sorry, I'll speak up. And so, coming from a military family, I've lived in many, many different cities. One thing was a constant, though. I've always been Black, right? And so, Mr. McBride, your description of trauma, I also do some trauma studying in my dissertation work, was spot on. And I appreciate the way that you spoke about it, because my community also has that generational trauma, and we are also sort of always in a traumatized state. Our sort of in our brain, it's always sort of going off. And so the ways in which different groups of people deal with that grieving about trauma, right? So for me, the murder of Emmett Till in the 1950s is still, it's not like it was, 56 years ago. It's, to me and my family, it's like it was yesterday. And so that colors my interactions with people, agencies that are in authority. And I come from a privileged background. I was upper middle class, so and yet it still colors the way in which I move and breathe and see the world around me. I think that anti-Semitism, and racism have some very similar causes. It's based in fear. So you spoke of a couple of things. I want to know, you talked about reconciliation. When reconciliation happens, I want you to just talk a little bit more about that. What is that? Is it possible? How do you do it? Can we describe what that looks like? And it may be different for different groups. And the other thing you spoke about is the authoritarian sort of leanings in our society that is going on now in multiple countries around the world. I want you to talk about, you didn't say this, Mr. McBride, but what you really said was, we got to be woke, right? So in my vernacular, it's called being woke. And what you said was something similar.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what that means, being woke. What are the things that we need to be looking for as we move further and further to an authoritarian or at least fascist way of living?
Pierre, those are just fantastic questions. I love those questions. So first of all, the first one, reconciliation. Reconciliation is talked about a lot, and it's incredibly difficult because because there's so many, for so many people, the division that is seeking to be reconciled is based on lifetimes and generations of experience. So what we are seeking to reconcile are relationships that are broken, where people fear, despise, whatever the other. And the purpose of reconciliation is to try and bring about some healing. So I think, and what I've learned about this is, first of all, that it is really difficult. Secondly, that you have to get beyond seeing sort of victims and perpetrators in this. And this becomes really difficult because genuine reconciliation occurs, in my mind, when both individuals and groups of people can relate to each other's suffering. And sadly, we find ourselves in a world now where everything appears very binary. In other words, we tend to talk about things in terms of victims and perpetrators. So that one community has hurt another community. Just reinforcing that rhetoric ends up, the issues of justice are inherent within that. But in terms of reconciliation, reinforcing that becomes quite destructive. In order to get to genuine reconciliation, people need to recognize their own pain and suffering and engage with one another in that way. So, the most current version of this is around Black Lives Matter. It's really difficult. The experience of suffering that people of color have had right back to, the days of the formation of the United States is a huge transgenerational trauma. There is no other way to describe it. And unless that trauma can be dealt with in some way, it is very difficult, I believe, for the Black community to experience the other, as in whites or other people of different colors, as not a threat. And I think this is one of the most difficult things that we have to understand. As a white man, and as I look at the screen, most of us are white people. What white privilege means is that we don't quite understand that, actually. We don't understand why anybody would be threatened by us, scared by us. I don't want to hurt anybody. I haven't done anything wrong. I don't want to do any harm. And what we need to realize is that this goes so deep into the psychology of the groups that I'm talking about, in terms of people of color and others, that we need to engage at a much deeper level on it and allow people to connect in a real way with their humanity. And the most powerful way to do that is to connect with the experience of suffering. So the experience of suffering within the Black community is very obvious. The experience of suffering within the white community has less interest in it, but is there and can be accessed. Second point you make is about what being woke means. So what do we need to look at?
Excuse me, Mr. McBride, I just want to, awesome. The experience of suffering in the white community takes on many different forms. I know we don't have enough time here to really talk about that, but it reminded me of the story that you just told, that you identified with the perpetrators. Yeah. And so that is the type of suffering I think you're speaking of. That identify. Right. Oh, okay, please continue.
No, it is absolutely. And I recognize how difficult this is to talk about, because it is not about equivocation. And the danger is we get into, the discussions about, about the hierarchy of victimhood, and Northern Ireland is full of this. That is real. There's certainly communities that have suffered far more than others. But in a way, it's not what I'm talking about. It's what you've just described. So you're quite right. And I think this, you can tell by the way I'm trying to say this requires, we need to be incredibly sensitive around this to make sure that we are connecting in a real and a human way. In terms of what to look out for and being woke, it is where there is the where there is any hint that another group, a group is being demonized or othered by people in power. In other words, whenever you have leadership that will identify an ethnic group as being, less value. I mean, I will use the example of, people being characterized as murderers or rapists or whatever. As soon as you find yourself in a position where people in power are identifying groups within society and othering those groups, and by othering, what I mean is creating a distinction between them and us, between their value and our value, between their rights and our rights. when we start to make those distinctions, whether they be based on ethnic differences, differences in color of skin, differences in religion, differences in economic education, whatever those differences are, whenever you see powers within society othering those groups, that's what we need to be vigilant for. Because that othering is the beginning of that process of being able to justify treating those groups differently and challenge and breaking the sense of equality and unanimity that we need. There's a word that I try to use as often as I can, and I haven't used it today, so I'm going to use it now. What we need to think about is how we are compassionate with one another. Compassion is a word that's made up of two bits. It means to suffer with. So, and that means being united. It means identifying with one another, not seeing each other as different. So the reason I talked originally about the importance of suffering is that the conclusion I've come to with all the work that I've done is the one thing, so you and I may come from different places. We may have grown up in different worlds. We may have different educations. We could name all the things about everybody on this call that is different. But the one thing I guarantee for all of us is that we have all suffered to different degrees and in different ways. And if we can connect that, we begin to connect our humanity. And when we begin to connect our humanity, we see each other as brothers and sisters rather than others. And it is that otherness that is the source of, the early steps, and people like Paul and Tom know this much better than I do, but are the early steps towards the justification of persecution, violence, and then ultimately things like genocide and the Holocaust, which was based on the complete othering of the Jewish people and therefore the justification of murder. So wokeness for me is challenging anything around otherness.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Pierre. This is obviously a conversation that could and should go on a lot more than we have time for today. And as a chamber, I'm committed to making sure that this conversation weaves through our work on a daily basis, and we'll figure out ways to do that. I personally had the honor of witnessing some of the testimony in the Truth and Reconciliation process in Cape Town, South Africa, in the mid-1990s, and it's a powerful thing. That there may be a germ of an idea in there somewhere that Peter and I have talked a little bit about, but that's a story for another day. It's just after 10 o'clock now, and I know people have other things they need to be doing today. We will be trying to do at least another one of these in the month of August, Coffee and Conversations, possibly two. So keep your eyes out for that. If anybody has an idea or thought about the type of session that would be interesting to people to do in this kind of time slot, let us know and the easiest way to let us know is just info@keenchamber.com. Just use that generic email address, and keep your eyes open on to our e-blast for the next one of these. And Phyllis just put that in the chat box, that email address. So I welcome your ideas. Stay tuned, stay cool out there today, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Thank you all very much.
Perfect session. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Keene State College alum, look forward to having you on campus.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, so Phyllis, you're saying you'll send the link to the recording to everybody who participated.
Yes, I'll take a look at it. Sometimes things at the beginning I edit out, but then once I have a clean recording, I'll put it on our YouTube channel and then share that link with all the guests.
Good.
Listen, I'm happy if you want to share my email address with people. I'm happy if they want to contact me directly.
Oh, okay.
Just if they have questions that they didn't feel they could ask
Okay, I'll add that then to the email I
Yeah,
sent.
please do.
Okay.
It's
Good.
peter.mcbride@keen.edu.
Okay, I have that, I think.
I didn't, Peter, get a chance to call on Elsa Worth, Reverend Worth from the St. James Episcopal Church in Keene. I don't know if you have had a chance to talk to her.
Just today, Phil. In
Yeah.
fact, just as we came on, she had responded to an email that I sent her. So we're due to have a chat, I think, next week.
Oh, good.
So,
And
yeah.
as you no doubt know, that was the home church of Jonathan Daniels,
Yeah.
Who grew up, I think, not more than 2 or 3 blocks from that church.
Yeah.
So she has a very interesting perspective, as does the entire faith community in the Monadnock region. So they'll be an important group to engage.
I'm really loving talking to people. Honestly, it's extremely interesting, and people are very engaged and encouraging, and very strong views, which is great. Really great to hear.
Excellent.
Yep. Peter, could I ask just a quick question, and maybe I can follow up with you via email? As I mentioned, I'm a Keene State College alum, many years back, by the way. Have the honor of representing Keene State on the University Board of Trustees system. But my question would be, if you had an opportunity to talk to a senior high school class, how would you engage their thought process about considering not just Keene State College, but more importantly, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program here? So
I think that's a really brilliant question, David, and it's a real challenge, because I think that, in my living memory, when I was growing up, I knew about the Holocaust. I was taught about it. My father, so you know what age I am, but my father was a teenager during the war, Second World War, and so this had some sort of living memory for us. Whereas young people growing up who are sort of 15 or 16 or 17 now, I don't think they have the same connection, the same connect. So this is why 2 things are important. One is, it is important to keep remembering the facts of the Holocaust. So, you visit Auschwitz, or you just see the sheer scale of things. It is important to be confronted with and to understand and to know that the facts of these terrible things. But what is equally important is to make the application. So what young people need to understand, and what I tried to do, and even when I was talking with you today, is to try to say, look, this is not just something that happened 80 years ago. The versions of this are happening today. People are doing the same things. So there's this mixture of horror and disbelief that something like that could have happened. And people think, well, that was a one-off, and something terrible like that. How on earth could something terrible like that have happened 80 years ago? It is another jump to realize that actually, as we sit here today, as honestly as we sit here today, people are doing similar things to one another. Now, not in the same scale and not in the same industrialized way, but in principle. And in principle, with the kind of modern mechanization that we have, the same could happen again. And I think that the challenge with this all the time is, I think that we want to remain positive. We want to find hope. We want to, try and make the best of things. There's some of this stuff is just, for me, terrifying. It's genuinely terrifying. I'm really worried about what's going on. And I don't want to sound like the sort of moaning Minnie in the corner, but I do think that German society sleepwalked into the Holocaust. It crept up on them. It wasn't that they woke up one day and thought, this is terrible, we shouldn't do it. It was a methodical, planned, over many years movement of a society to the point at which it was acceptable, to a large part, for their government to do what they did. And I worry that we're in the early stages of that sleepwalking in various parts of the world now. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know how young people would hear what I'm saying. I think the challenge is to find the connection point for them about their relationships with one another, examples where they have done that othering thing that I've described, or they've maybe experienced it. most of us have done both. You know, we've othered other people and we've experienced it ourselves. So it's how you kind of get them to connect it to their own experience. But let's talk. Email me, and I'm happy to
Will
kind of
do.
explore that with you. I really love to. I need to learn this stuff as well.
Thank you.
My pleasure.